I want to tell you about the day my son-in-law called me dad for the first time. We were standing on the terrace of my office, 42 floors above the Chicago skyline. The wind carried the scent of Lake Michigan, cold and clean. Marcus was holding a coffee I'd had my assistant bring up. It was looking out at the water with the easy confidence of a man who had never once worried about what tomorrow might bring. "I want you to know something, Dad," he said, turning toward me. His eyes had that steady warmth I'd come to trust. "I didn't marry Emma for any of this. I need you to believe that." He looked at him for a long moment. He was 34 years old, 3 years into his career as a corporate attorney. Always impeccably dressed. The kind of face that made people open their checkbooks. Open, attentive eyes that seemed to listen before you'd even finished speaking. "I believe you," I said. "God help me, I meant every word of it." That was 2 years ago. eBay spent the last 60 days making sure Marcus Hale never calls anyone dad again. My name is Richard Brennan. I'm 63 years old. I built Brennan Transport from 2 beat-up delivery vans and a rented garage on the south side into one of the largest distribution networks in the Midwest. We move freight across 22 states. We employ over 1,200 people. We turn somewhere north of $300 million a year. But none of that is what I'm proud of. What I'm proud of is Emma, her mother, Catherine, was the kind of woman who made every room feel like it had been waiting for her. She had a laugh that could cut through the darkest day and a way of looking at you that made you feel completely seen. We lost her to breast cancer 13 years ago, when Emma was just 19. The diagnosis came in November. She was gone by April. I remember sitting in the hospital corridor after the doctors told us there was nothing more they could do. Emma reached over and took my hand. She was 19 years old, her mother was dying, and she was the one comforting me. She held my hand and said, "We're going to be okay, Dad. We're going to figure this out together." And we did. Emma grew up with no interest in money or what came with it. She studied social work at Northwestern. It's been 3 years running a community center in Englewood, working with families who had nothing. She never wanted her name in the business press. When she finally told me she wanted to go back for her master's degree in counseling, her eyes lit up the way Catherine's used to when she talked about something she truly loved. I wrote the tuition check with the happiest hands I'd ever had. When Emma brought Marcus home for the first time, I was cautious. I'm always cautious about men who come into my daughter's life. I know what's attached to her name, whether she wants it to be or not. But Marcus was different, or he performed being different with such consistency that I couldn't find the seam. I asked intelligent questions and waited for the full answer before responding. It pushed back respectfully when he disagreed with me, which I respected far more than easy agreement. It called me sir for the first 6 months, then shifted to dad so naturally that I couldn't tell you exactly when it happened. He told me once over dinner at a steakhouse on Michigan Avenue that the Brennan name made him feel the pressure of a man trying to prove he belonged, not the comfort of someone who thought he'd found a shortcut. That's the right way to feel about it, I told him. I know, he said. That's why I'm telling you. In the second year of their marriage, I made a decision I now understand was a mistake, though it didn't look like one at the time. He was preparing to step back from the day-to-day operations of the company. My cardiologist had been after me about my blood pressure, and my attorney of 20 years had been quietly recommending for months that I begin the process of transition. I offered Marcus a temporary operational role overseeing 3 of our regional distribution branches. At this, I told myself, I'll wait to see how he handled responsibility before I made any permanent decisions about the company's future structure. Marcus accepted with exactly the right amount of gratitude, not too eager, not falsely modest. "I won't let you down, Dad," he said, and his voice was so steady and so warm that my chest ached with something I can only describe as relief. One evening, about 4 months into his role, Marcus and I were having bourbon on the terrace. Emma had gone to bed early with a headache, and he asked me a question that I've replayed in my mind more times than I can count. "Can I ask you something about the company's ownership structure?" he said, "just so I understand it properly. In terms of inheritance and succession planning, how is the equity currently distributed?" He told him clearly and completely, because he was family, and it seemed like exactly the kind of responsible question a man in his position should be asking. He nodded thoughtfully, swirling the bourbon in his glass. "That makes sense," he said. "Emma's a lucky woman to have a father who thinks ahead." I thought it was the comment of a man taking his responsibilities seriously. 3 months later, my daughter went into emergency cardiac surgery, and everything I thought I knew about Marcus Hale began to unravel. Emma came home from the hospital on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the surgery. She was pale and thin in a way that made my throat tighten every time I looked at her. Not the pale of someone who needed rest, but the pale of someone who had been genuinely close to the edge and hadn't quite made it all the way back yet. The surgical team at Northwestern Memorial had repaired the defect in her mitral valve, but the recovery protocol was strict and unforgiving. Complete bed rest for a minimum of 3 months. Medication administered at precise intervals every single day. A portable oxygen concentrator on standby at all times. And a cardiac monitor that beeped softly every few seconds, like a small insistent reminder of how fragile the whole arrangement was. I had already contacted a private nursing agency, 3 qualified nurses rotating 8-hour shifts around the clock. I'd interviewed each one personally and checked their references twice. He told Marcus the week before Emma was discharged. He looked at me across the kitchen table with an expression of such gentle concern that I almost didn't notice how carefully it had been arranged on his face. "Richard," he said, setting down his coffee cup, "I hear you, and I know you want the best for her, but Emma told me herself, she doesn't want strangers in the house while she's recovering. She needs to feel safe, not managed." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to something intimate and reasonable. "We can handle this as a family. Mom is already offering to come stay. Vanessa wants to help. Emma needs people who love her, not people on a payroll." He looked at him for a long moment, my jaw tight. Something in my chest pushed back against his words, a low and wordless unease I couldn't yet name. "She needs her medication on time," I said. "Every single day, without exception." "Absolutely," Marcus said, meeting my eyes with total steadiness. "I give you my word." He should have trusted the unease. He should have trusted it completely. Patricia Hale arrived 2 days after Emma came home, pulling up to the Lakeshore Drive entrance in a black town car with 4 pieces of matching luggage and the unhurried certainty of a woman who had already decided the house belonged to her. She was 58 years old, sharp-featured with the kind of posture that announced itself before she spoke. She kissed Emma on the forehead with practiced tenderness and then turned to survey the master bedroom with the appraising eye of someone taking inventory. "We'll need to rearrange a few things," she announced, adjusting a pillow behind Emma's head with efficient proprietary hands. "The lighting in here is terrible for a recovery room, and that chair needs to go closer to the window." "Ma'am, the chair is fine," Emma said, her voice thin but patient. "Darling, I've raised 2 children. You know what a recovery room needs." Patricia patted Emma's hand with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, then turned to me. "Richard, you must be relieved to have us here. Family is what she needs right now." He smiled back at her with every muscle in my face working independently of my actual feelings. Of course, I said. Thank you for coming, Patricia. Vanessa arrived the following afternoon, Marcus's younger sister, 27 years old, moving through life with the breezy entitlement of someone who had never once been told no. She swept into the bedroom with an armful of flowers and a carry-on bag that clinked faintly when she set it down. Wine bottles, I suspected, for the adults who were doing the hard work of visiting the sick. Oh, Emma, you look exhausted, Vanessa said, sitting on the edge of the bed and squeezing Emma's hand with the enthusiasm of someone performing concern for an audience. But honestly, still gorgeous. How do you do it? She laughed, tossing her hair, and then glanced at the cardiac monitor with the faint distaste of someone encountering an object that had no business being in a room she'd decided to enjoy. I watched Vanessa's eyes travel to the small medication organizer on Emma's nightstand. 7 compartments, each one labeled with a day of the week. Each one filled with the precise combination of drugs keeping my daughter's heart functioning properly. She looked at it for exactly 1 second too long. My stomach dropped 3 floors. That evening, after Marcus had poured everyone wine in the living room, and the conversation had turned to the Hale family's upcoming social calendar, a fundraiser in the Gold Coast, a friend's gallery opening in River North, I excused myself and walked to the far end of the hallway. He called my attorney, Robert Stafford. It picked up on the second ring. Richard, what's wrong? Maybe nothing, I said, keeping my voice low. Probably nothing, but I want you on notice. On notice for what? I leaned against the wall, pressing my palm flat against the cool plaster. My heart was doing something uncomfortable in my chest. Not pain, just a steady, insistent alarm, like a phone ringing in another room. I don't know yet, I said honestly. I just need you to be reachable. Robert was quiet for a beat. He had known me for 20 years, long enough to understand that when I said I didn't know yet, I meant I knew enough to be worried. I'm always reachable, he said. Call me the second you have something specific. He stood there after I hung up, listening to the laughter drifting down the hallway from the living room. Vanessa sang something that made Marcus chuckle. Patricia's voice carrying above both of theirs with the satisfied ring of a woman who believed she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Then I went online and spent 40 minutes researching home medical equipment suppliers. The device I found was a backup cardiac oxygen concentrator, a model with an internal battery capable of running for 72 hours without external power, a built-in cellular modem that sent automated status alerts to a designated account, and a motion sensor that flagged the absence of user activity. It was not cheap. I didn't care about that. He registered the device under the emergency services account of Brennan Transport rather than my personal name. I arranged for it to be delivered discreetly, accepted it personally at the door, and installed it myself in the narrow space between Emma's wardrobe and the wall, tucked behind a spare blanket, completely invisible unless you were looking for it. He told no one. Not Emma, not Robert, not Frank Dole, my head of security, who I trusted with most things. The device was my contingency, my quiet line in the sand, and the fact that I felt I needed one at all told me more than I wanted to know about what my instincts were already calculating. That same evening, I heard Patricia's voice from the kitchen below my room. She was talking to Vanessa, and though I couldn't make out every word through the floor, two came through with perfect clarity. Trust fund. My hand tightened around the edge of the windowsill until my knuckles ached with a sharp bone-deep pressure. The unease I'd been carrying since Marcus talked me out of the nursing agency sharpened into something colder and more specific. He stood at the window looking out at Lake Michigan going dark in the evening light, and I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that for exactly 4 more days. Then I called Robert again, and this time I had something specific. Marcus called me on a Wednesday morning, 9 days after Emma came home from the hospital. He was at my desk on the 42nd floor working through a quarterly distribution report when his name appeared on my phone screen. He picked up on the second ring. "Richard." His voice was warm and unhurried, the way it always was when he'd already decided how a conversation was going to end. "Do you have a few minutes? He wanted to run something by you." "Go ahead," I said. "The family has been talking," he said. "And we think a change of scenery would do everyone some good. Patricia has been exhausted from the caregiving, and Vanessa and I have been carrying a lot of stress with everything that's happened. We've been looking at an expedition cruise. Iceland, Greenland, Svalbard. 60 days, private vessel, fully staffed, the kind of trip that genuinely resets you." It paused, and in that pause I heard the careful architecture of what he was about to say next. "We're thinking of leaving in about 2 weeks." He set my pen down on the desk very carefully. The way you set something down when your hand has started to shake and you don't want anyone to know. "Who's staying with Emma?" he asked. The pause that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds too long. "That's actually what I wanted to discuss," Marcus said. "We've had a conversation with Dr. Mitchell, the cardiologist who's been consulting on Emma's case, and she's confirmed that Emma has stabilized enough that short periods without direct supervision are medically acceptable. I'll forward you the email. It has her signature and her credentials." My jaw tightened until I could feel the pressure in my back teeth. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice level with considerable effort. "Your wife had open heart surgery 3 weeks ago. She cannot walk to the kitchen without getting winded. She requires medication administered on a precise schedule every single day. What exactly does Dr. Mitchell consider a short period?" "Richard, I understand your concern. Answer the question." Another pause, shorter this time. "The documentation will explain everything. I really think once you read it, you'll feel better about the situation." I didn't feel better. Not even close. The email arrived 40 minutes later. It was formatted on what appeared to be official letterhead, Dr. Evelyn Mitchell, Cardiology Consultants of Chicago, credentials listed below her name in clean professional font. The language was measured and clinical. Patient demonstrates satisfactory post-operative stability. Vital signs within acceptable parameters. Medication self-administration feasible with appropriate reminders. I read it 3 times. It wasn't the signature that troubled me. He had no way to question that. It was the language. Too clinical. Too convenient. The phrasing of someone who had been told exactly what to write rather than someone who had examined a patient and formed an opinion. But I couldn't prove that either. He forwarded it to Robert with a single line. "Look at this. Tell me what you think." He called Emma that afternoon. The phone rang 4 times before she picked up, and when she did, her voice was soft and slightly breathless in a way that made my chest contract with worry. "Hey, Ad." She coughed slightly. "Sorry, just woke up from a nap." "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" "Better," she said. "A little better every day." In the background, I heard Marcus's voice low, close, asking who she was talking to. The shift in Emma's breathing was almost imperceptible, but I'd known her for 31 years. He heard it. "It's just that," she said away from the phone, then back to me, her voice brightening artificially in a way that made my throat ache. I should probably rest some more. Can I call you back later? Of course, I said. I love you, Emma. Love you, too, Dad. The line went dead. That I sat holding the phone for a long moment, my thumb pressed against the screen until the display went dark. Something was twisting in my gut. Not suspicion anymore, but something sharper and more primitive, something that felt very much like fear. He drove to Lakeshore Drive that evening. Marcus met me at the door before I'd even knocked, which told me he'd seen me on the security camera feed. He was dressed casually, dark slacks, a linen shirt, and he smiled at me with the polished ease of a man who had prepared for exactly this conversation. Richard, come in. Can I get you something? I want to see Emma, I said. She's sleeping, Marcus said. She had a tough afternoon. Her body is still adjusting. The doctor said rest is the priority right now. He stepped back to let me into the foyer, gesturing toward the living room. Come, sit down. Let's talk. Patricia appeared at the top of the stairs, looking down at me with an expression of careful neutrality. Vanessa was somewhere in the back of the house. He could hear music playing faintly from another room. The whole scene had the quality of something rehearsed, positions taken and held. He followed Marcus into the living room. He sat. He sat across from me and laced his fingers together in that thoughtful way of his, and I had the sudden, very clear sensation of sitting across a negotiating table from someone who had already read all my documents. I know this feels abrupt, Marcus said. And I know how much you love Emma, but Richard, we need this. Patricia has barely slept in 3 weeks. Vanessa had to put her entire life on hold. And honestly, he looked down briefly, then back up at me, and his eyes were doing something complicated, something that wanted to look like honesty. I've been running on empty. You need to know that when I come back, I'm going to be the husband Emma deserves. I can't give her that if I'm depleted. He looked at him for a long moment. My hands were completely still in my lap. My voice when I spoke came out quieter than I intended. If something happens to her while you're gone. Nothing is going to happen, Marcus said firmly. Dr. Mitchell has signed off. We each have a home health aide check-in every few days. Emma has her phone, and we're only a flight away if anything urgent comes up. On the way out, I passed through the corridor near the kitchen and saw Vanessa pulling Emma's large medication organizer from the cabinet shelf. She was holding it loosely, examining the labeled compartments with the idle curiosity of someone who hadn't yet decided what to do with what they were holding. She looked up and saw me watching. She smiled. Just reorganizing, she said lightly. He smiled back. He said good night. He walked to my car. I sat behind the wheel on Lakeshore Drive for 6 minutes. I know, because I watched the clock on the dashboard, and I called Frank Dahl. Frank had been my head of security for 11 years. He was a former Secret Service agent, 55 years old, built like a man who had never once in his life made a hasty decision. He picked up on the first ring. M.R. Brennan. Frank, I said. I need you to be on standby starting now. Understood, Frank said without asking a single question. That was one of the things I valued most about him. 2 days later, Marcus sent me a text at 11 in the morning. All set for tomorrow night. ORH Reykjavik. 11:15 de la noche. Talk soon. He called Emma's phone immediately. It went straight to voicemail, her recorded voice bright and clear and completely unreachable. He called again at 3 in the afternoon. Voicemail. He called at 7 in the evening. Voicemail. That night, I stood at my window watching the lights of the city and tried to convince myself that I was wrong about all of it. That Marcus was a man under pressure who needed a break. That Patricia was a difficult woman but not a dangerous one. That Vanessa had just been reorganizing medication exactly as she said. He was still standing there at 11:15 when my phone lit up with a text from a car service app, a notification for a ride booked under Marcus's corporate account. Destination ORA International Airport, passengers 3. He put the phone face down on the windowsill. My hands, for the first time that evening, had started to tremble. He didn't find out what happened inside that house until the 10th day after we brought Emma in. She had been conscious for 3 days by then, but the doctors wanted her genuinely stable before they allowed anything that might spike her heart rate. Estrés, they told me, was as dangerous to her right now as any physical exertion. So I waited. He sat in the chair beside her bed for hours at a stretch, reading reports I couldn't focus on, drinking coffee that went cold before I remembered it was there, watching the cardiac monitor trace its steady green line and telling myself that line was the only thing that mattered right now. On the 10th day, Emma looked at me from her pillow and said, "I need to tell you what happened, Dad. I love it, before I lose my nerve." He set down the folder I was holding. "You don't have to do this today," I said, though every part of me needed to hear it. "Yes, I do." Her voice was still thin, still carrying that fragile quality that made my chest hurt every time I heard it. But her eyes were clear and completely resolved. "Close the door." He closed the door. He pulled my chair closer to the bed. He folded my hands in my lap, looked at my daughter, and listened. "It started 2 weeks before they left," Emma said. "Not the night they left. 2 weeks before." She paused, adjusting the oxygen cannula beneath her nose. Her hands were steadier than they had been 2 days ago. I noticed everything about her now with an attention so acute it was almost painful. "My medication," she said, clearing her throat. "Someone switched it. The pills looked identical. Same color, same size, same shape, but they had no active compound. My heart was getting weaker, and I thought it was just the recovery being slow." She swallowed hard, her throat working. "It wasn't the recovery. They were feeding me sugar pills, Dad." The breath went out of me like something had reached into my chest and squeezed. My hands tightened in my lap until my knuckles burned white and hot. He did not speak. He could not speak. He sat there and let the full weight of what she was telling me land completely, because she needed me present and steady, and I was not going to fall apart in front of her. "How do you know?" I managed, my voice lower and rougher than I intended. "Because when the real medication restarted here, the improvement was too fast," Emma said. Dr. Reeves, the attending cardiologist, told me the degree of deterioration I'd experienced in those 2 weeks was inconsistent with a properly managed post-surgical recovery. He said it looked more like a patient who hadn't been medicated at all. She looked at me steadily. "Marcus refilled my prescription himself twice. Said he didn't want me worrying about logistics while I was recovering." I thought about Marcus at a pharmacy counter, smiling at the pharmacist, being attentive, being the devoted husband. Then I thought about what he'd actually carried home. My jaw was aching. I hadn't realized how hard I'd been clenching it. "Keep going," I said. Emma took a slow breath. Her voice dropped slightly, as though the memory required a different register. "The night they left," she said, "Marcus came into the bedroom around 9. Patricia and Vanessa were already downstairs with the luggage. It was dressed for travel, a gray coat with the wide lapels." She paused. "He went to the medication cabinet first. Talk everything. Every bottle, every blister pack, the weekly organizer, the backup supply in the drawer. I left it into a black canvas bag. He asked what he was doing. He said he was just reorganizing, that someone would drop off a fresh supply in the morning. Did you believe him? He asked. Emma's eyes filled, not the easy tears of someone looking for sympathy, but the slow, reluctant tears of someone recounting a humiliation they hadn't yet finished forgiving themselves for. I wanted to, she said quietly. I kept wanting to, Dad. Even then. She pressed her lips together until they steadied. After the medication, he took the laptop, then my phone from the nightstand, then the charging cables. He said the electronics were being moved to a safer location while the house systems were being serviced. She laughed, a short humorless sound that was worse than crying. I actually nodded. He actually said, okay. He pressed my palm flat against my knee. The pressure helped me stay in the chair. Vanessa came in next, Emma said. She went to the medical equipment panel, the one that controls power to the room's oxygen and monitoring systems, and switched it off. Sid, there had been a circuit issue. She didn't meet my eyes when she said it. Emma's voice cracked slightly, then steadied with visible effort. She didn't meet my eyes, Dad. I thought about Vanessa at 27 years old, standing in her sister-in-law's sick room, switching off life-sustaining equipment and choosing not to look at the woman in the bed. I thought about the deliberateness of it, the practiced indifference. Something cold and absolute settled in my chest and did not move. Then Marcus came back, Emma said. Her hands had begun to tremble against the blanket, fingers pressing together as though holding something in. He stood in the doorway and looked at me. Then he said, she stopped, swallowed, this will all be over soon. He turned off the light, closed the door. He heard the deadbolt from outside. The cardiac monitor kept its steady rhythm. Outside, distant footsteps, an overhead page, the hum of a city moving regardless of what was being said in this room. I tried to get up, Emma said, barely above a whisper. 3 times. My legs wouldn't hold me. By the second day, I couldn't get further than the floor beside the bed. She looked down at her hands. I found my lipstick in the pocket of the cardigan I was wearing. A grocery receipt on the nightstand. I thought if I write something down and someone finds me, at least they'll know it wasn't an accident. He thought about my daughter lying on the floor in the dark in the June heat, with no water and no medication and no way to call for help, writing on the back of a receipt with a lipstick she found in her pocket. He thought about how much she must have loved me to believe even then that I was coming. My eyes were burning. He did not let them fill. He pressed my fist against my mouth for exactly 3 seconds, then lowered my hand and breathed. You did exactly right, I said. My voice was steady. He made sure of it. You did everything exactly right. Emma looked at me and for just a moment her composure slipped entirely, her face crumpling, breath hitching, a single tear sliding down her cheek before she pressed her hand over her eyes and pulled herself back together with a discipline that reminded me so sharply of her mother that my heart contracted like a fist. I knew you'd come, she said, her voice muffled behind her hand. I just didn't know if I'd still be awake when you did. He reached over and covered her hand with mine. There was nothing to say that wasn't already there between us in the room, in the green line on the monitor, in the fact that we were both still here. What I did say after a lone moment was this. Rest now. I have some phone calls to make. I need to go back to the night before Emma told me any of this. The night I found out how close I'd come to losing her forever. Because the story doesn't move forward until you understand what 3 17 pulgadas. The morning looks like when you're a father who already knows something is wrong but can't yet prove it. He hadn't been sleeping since the Hales car pulled away from Lake Shore Drive. He'd been operating on 2 or 3 hours at a stretch, waking with my heart hammering, my mind running through scenarios I didn't want to finish. He sat at my home office desk in the dark, working through reports I'd already read twice, drinking coffee I didn't taste, waiting for something I couldn't name. At 3:17 de la mañana on the third day, my phone lit up. The alert was red. I'd configured it that way deliberately, so it could never be mistaken for something routine. Brennan Transport, Emergency Medical Device Alert, Unit ID, BTIEMD-0047, Lake Shore Drive. Status, offline for 51 hours, 23 minutos. Last user activity, not detected. He was on my feet before I had finished reading it. The trembling in my hands stopped the moment the alert came through, replaced by something colder. The clarity that arrives when the thing you've been dreading finally shows its face, and there's nothing left to do but move. Marcus, 4 rings, voicemail. I didn't leave a message. Patricia, 1 ring, decline. Vanessa, straight to voicemail. Emma's number rang 8 times in an empty room before voicemail picked up. He called Robert. He answered on the second ring. Richard, what's happened? The medical device at Emma's house has been offline for 51 hours, I said, keeping my voice even with considerable effort. He can't reach anyone. Cal CPD, welfare check at the Lake Shore Drive address. Do it while I'm getting dressed. Donnie, Robert said. I'm calling the moment we hang up. He called Frank Dobb. Fierce Street. M.R. Brennan. Immediate presence, I said. No Grogines. Lake Shore Drive now. Emma is inside and not responding. 8 minutes, Frank said. The line went dead. He was in my car in 4. The drive from Gold Coast took 7 minutes at 3:22 de la mañana. I remember the red lights I drove through. I remember my hands on the wheel being absolutely steady. Not from calm, but because I had no room left for anything that wasn't getting to that house. Frank's SUV was already at the curb when I arrived. I stood beside it in dark clothes, duffel bag over one shoulder, completely unreadable, completely ready. The CPD patrol car came around the corner 60 seconds later. The officer, nameplate Rodriguez, listened as I explained the medical device alert, Emma's cardiac surgery, 3 days of silence. Rodriguez radioed dispatch and confirmed grounds for emergency entry. I'm her emergency medical contact, I said. The device is registered under Brennan Transport account number, available on request. We're going in with you, Rodriguez said. Frank went first up the stairs, his team behind him, officers behind them, me last because Frank had positioned me there deliberately. The 4th floor hallway was absolutely quiet. No light under Emma's door. Frank knocked twice and called out. Nothing. He looked at me. He nodded. First try, the door held. Second try, it held. Third try, it gave way with a sound like a gunshot, swinging hard into the interior wall. The air that rushed out was stale and warm and raw before my brain had finished processing it. He went in first. Frank led me. Living room dark. Kitchen dark. Down the hall, bedroom door, phone flashlight on. Emma was on the floor beside the bed. She had tried to crawl to the door, made it 4 feet before her body gave out. She lay on her side, one arm extended, fingers still curved as though reaching for something. Her lips were the color of a bruise. Her breathing was so shallow I watched her chest for 3 full seconds before I was certain. I dropped to my knees and put my hand on her face. Cold. Clammy. Real. Emma. My voice came out broken in a way I hadn't planned for. Dad's here. Stay with me. Her eyelids moved. He took her hand in both of mine and pressed it between my palms. You're going to be okay, I said. I've got you. Her fingers tightened fractionally around mine. It was the best thing I had ever felt. The paramedics arrived 4 minutes after Frank's call. I heard them before I saw them, the controlled urgency of people moving fast without running, equipment cases and a collapsible stretcher navigating the corridor. He was still on the floor beside Emma when they came through the bedroom door, and I had to make myself stand up and step back. Every part of me wanted to stay between my daughter and the rest of the world. But the people coming through that door were the ones who could actually help her, and getting out of their way was the only useful thing I could do. The lead paramedic dropped to one knee beside Emma and had his fingers on her wrist before he'd finished speaking. Sir, step back to the doorway. Name, age, primary medical condition. Emma Calloway, I said. 31, post-operative cardiac recovery, mitral valve repair, Northwestern Memorial, 4 weeks ago. Without medication and supplemental oxygen for at least 51 hours. He paused. Her medication was deliberately removed from the premises. The paramedic looked up at me briefly, just long enough for something to move behind his eyes. Then he turned back to Emma and started issuing instructions in the clipped shorthand of emergency medicine. Officer Rodriguez stood beside me, notebook open, asking questions I answered without fully registering. Insurance carrier, emergency contacts, other residents of the unit. Where are they? Rodriguez asked. Iceland, I said. Greenland, Svalbard. Somewhere in the Arctic on a private cruise vessel. I heard myself say it and understood for the first time completely what those words meant. They had put an ocean between themselves and what they'd done. They were standing on glaciers drinking champagne while my daughter lay on the floor in the dark. My vision blurred. I pressed my fingertips hard against the door frame until it passed. It was Frank who found the note. He crouched beside the spot where Emma had been lying and picked something up with 2 fingers, holding it carefully by the corner. Richard, he said. He crossed the room. A small rectangle of thermal receipt paper, folded twice, slightly damp at one corner. He unfolded it. Red lipstick, deep burgundy, the shade Emma had worn since college, the same shade her mother had favored. The letters were uneven and effortful. The handwriting of someone working against a body failing to comply, but completely legible. She had pressed hard enough to make sure of that. Dad, Marcus planned this. Check the clock. He read it 3 times. My daughter had known. She had lain on the floor in the dark with no water, no medication, no way to call for help, and she had found a lipstick in her cardigan pocket and a receipt on the nightstand. And she had written me exactly what I needed. She had trusted I was coming. He folded the note along its original creases and placed it in my breast pocket directly over my heart and buttoned it closed. Frank watched me do it. He understood, I could see it in the set of his jaw. Not evidence for Rodriguez at 4 de la mañana. Its importance required protection. That time would come. Don't mention it tonight, I said quietly. He nodded once. They carried Emma out at 4:23 de la mañana. Robert arrived 11 minutes after we reached the hospital, still pulling on his jacket. "How bad?" he asked. "Bad," I said. "But she's alive." He touched the breast pocket briefly. "She left me a note." "What kind?" "The kind that tells us exactly where to start." He looked at him steadily. "Don't call the police." "Not yet. Get me every piece of security footage from the last 72 hours, the concierge logs, and the legal status of every authorization Marcus holds within my company." Robert pulled out his phone. "First briefing," I said, 8 a.m., my office. He sat down in the corridor, put my face in my hands, and stayed like that for 90 seconds. Long enough to feel the full weight of the last 4 hours. Long enough to acknowledge it. Then I sat up straight. 57 days left. And I intended to use every single one of them. Robert arrived at my office at 8 exactly, as I'd asked. He set his briefcase on the conference table, took out 3 folders, and arranged them in front of him with the unhurried precision of a man who had spent the night working and wasn't going to let it show. He had been there since 6. The coffee on my desk was my 3rd cup. He hadn't tasted any of them. "Security footage from the building," he said, tapping the first folder. "Concierge logs, entry and exit records going back 4 weeks." He tapped the second. "Every authorization Marcus currently holds within Brennan Transport, signing authority, proxy designations, credit accounts." He tapped the third. "A full accounting of the supplementary cards in Marcus's name, Patricia's name, and Vanessa's name." He picked up the 3rd folder first. 4 days, $63,000, not on anything resembling a business expense. A helicopter tour over the Vatnajökull Glacier. Dinner for 3 at a Michelin-starred restaurant in. Robert placed the credit card statement on the table between us. 4 days, $63,000. A helicopter tour over the Vatnajökull Glacier. Dinner for 3 at a Michelin-starred restaurant in Reykjavik, $1,400. A fur-lined parka for Patricia that cost more than most people's monthly rent. I thought about Emma on the floor of her bedroom, 4 feet from the door. That was as far as she had managed to crawl. He closed the folder. "Don't freeze the cards," I said. Robert nodded slowly. "I assumed you'd say that." "Every dollar they spend is a document," I said. "Every transaction has a timestamp, a location, a merchant record. You want all of it. 57 days of it." He looked at him steadily. "Revoke every authorization Marcus holds. File the paperwork and execute it within the week. Quietly. No notifications, no flags, no announcements. Under Illinois law, I can do that unilaterally. So do it." "Donnie," Robert said. He reached into the briefcase and placed a printed sheet in front of me. Marcus standing on a glacier, champagne glass in hand, smiling like a man with nothing to hide. The caption read, "The world looks different from up here. Grateful for every breath of it." Posted at 11:42 de la mañana Reykjavik time. At that exact moment, my daughter was in an ICU bed, 14 time zones away, a cardiac monitor doing the work her own heart couldn't manage alone. He turned the printout face down. On day 4, an unknown number called my phone. He answered. A pause. Then Marcus, his voice unmistakable, calling from the ship's satellite line, expecting silence because he believed the only person who might have answered was no longer capable of answering. He listened to him breathe for 3 seconds. Then I ended the call. 11 seconds total. He logged it with Robert. He called twice more. Day 7, day 12. EHTime, silence. EHTime, I logged it. It was using absence as confirmation. It was methodical. He had to admit that. He hadn't planned carefully enough. On day 10, Emma opened her eyes properly for the first time. Not the half-conscious flickers of the first week. Genuinely awake, tracking, present. She looked at me and said, "Dad." He said, "I'm here." We didn't need anything else for 10 minutes. Before she slept again, she looked at me with those clear eyes. "You didn't call them, did you?" "Not a question." "No," I said. Something moved across her face. Trust, the deep kind. "Good," she said. "Don't." He reached into my breast pocket and took out the folded note. Red lipstick, slightly damp corner. "Check the club." I folded it, put it back, and called Patrick Shaw. "Mr. Brennan," he said, picking up on the first ring. "I was wondering when you'd call." "Go through the company cloud server," I said. "Every file, every upload, every automated log from any device Marcus Hale connected to our system." "How soon?" "As soon as you find something, which I think will be sooner than you expect." He put the phone down. Outside, the Chicago skyline was going gold in the afternoon light. 53 days left. Somewhere above the Arctic Circle, Marcus Hale was raising another glass, completely certain the hardest part was already over. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. On day 14, Robert called me at 6:50 pulgadas the morning and said 4 words that I had learned over 20 years to take very seriously. "Come in," he said. Now. He was at his office on LaSalle Street by 7:30. Robert's firm occupied the top 2 floors of a building that had been housing serious legal work since before either of us was born. His personal office had the particular quality of a room that had witnessed a great many difficult conversations and absorbed them all without comment. It was standing at the window when I arrived. Robert almost always sat, which told me before he opened his mouth that whatever he had found was significant. He turned when I came in and pointed at the chair across from his desk. "Sit down, Richard." He sat. He placed 3 documents on the desk between us. The first was a loan agreement, 40 pages dense with legal language, bearing the letterhead of a private banking institution I recognized as one of the most discreet and least scrupulous lenders in the city. The second was a signature page with Emma's name printed beneath a cursive signature that I stared at for a long moment before I understood what I was looking at. "That's not her signature," I said. "No," Robert said. "It is not. It's close." The person who forged it had done their homework. The loop of the A, the particular way Emma's lowercase letters sit slightly above the baseline. But it's not right. He had signed enough documents alongside my daughter's signature over the years to know the difference. $22 million, Robert said. Secured against Emma's equity stake in Brennan Transport. The loan was processed 11 days ago, 4 days before they left for the Arctic. The disbursement went into an account with preliminary indicators suggesting offshore routing. He folded his hands on the desk. Under Illinois law, forging a signature on a financial instrument of this value constitutes a Class II felony. Under federal statute, the bank fraud component carries a maximum of 30 years. He looked at the signature for another long moment. I thought about Marcus sitting at his desk in the home office of the Lakeshore Drive property, carefully practicing my daughter's handwriting. How many sheets of paper he would have gone through. How deliberate and patient and thorough he would have had to be. My stomach turned over slowly, like something heavy shifting in deep water. "What's the third document?" he asked. Robert placed it in front of me carefully. The word carefully was deliberate, I realized. The way you set something down when you already know how it's going to land. It was the medical clearance letter, the one Marcus had emailed me the morning he announced the Arctic trip. The letter on Dr. Mitchell's letterhead, confirming Emma was stable enough to be left without continuous medical supervision. The signature on this letter, Robert said, is genuine. He looked up at him. Dr. Evelyn Mitchell is a board-certified cardiologist practicing independently in Chicago. She was not Emma's primary treating physician. She was never part of the main surgical team. She was brought in as a consulting specialist 6 weeks before the surgery, at Marcus's specific request, to provide what he described as an independent second opinion. Robert paused. She sent the clearance letter knowingly, but I spoke with her this morning. She called me yesterday evening. She said she hadn't slept in 2 weeks. I looked at me steadily. She's in the conference room. She came voluntarily. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Dr. Evelyn Mitchell was 52 years old with the kind of face that suggested she had once been very composed and was currently working extremely hard to locate that composure again. She was sitting at the conference table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she hadn't touched. When I walked in, she stood up immediately, not out of social reflex, but because sitting felt wrong to her in this particular moment. Mr. Brennan. Her voice was steady, but her hands when she set the cup down were not. I owe you an explanation and an apology, and I understand if neither is sufficient. He sat across from her and waited. She took a long, controlled breath. Marcus Hale contacted me in March, she said. 4 months before your daughter's surgery. He said he was concerned about Emma's long-term prognosis and wanted an independent clinical perspective. He was charming and well-informed. She stopped. Her jaw tightened. One of the questions he asked was this. If a patient with a congenital mitral valve condition failed to receive her prescribed cardiac medication for 48 hours or more after surgery, what would the likely clinical outcome be? The coffee cup was completely still on the table. My hands in my lap were completely still. I answered him clinically and completely, Dr. Mitchell said, her voice dropping to something smaller and more ashamed. I told him that without medication, a post-surgical patient in Emma's condition would experience rapid deterioration, irregular rhythm, fluid accumulation, potential organ stress. Without intervention, the timeline to a critical event would be measured in days, not weeks. She looked down. He thanked me professionally and left. He told myself it was a concerned husband asking responsible questions. But it wasn't. He said nothing. 3 months later, he called again, she continued. He wanted a formal clearance letter confirming Emma could manage brief periods without direct supervision. For insurance documentation, he said. He also told me that if I declined, he would file a complaint with the state medical board, claiming I had provided negligent advice that contributed to a deterioration in his wife's condition. I had a recording of our first conversation. I had notes, dates, timestamps. She pressed her lips together until they widened. I was afraid, she said, and the words came out raw and stripped of everything professional. I was afraid and I was wrong, and I signed the letter. And then I watched the news every morning for 2 weeks, waiting to read that Emma Brennan had died of post-surgical complications. Her voice broke entirely, and she pressed her hand over her mouth, one single suppressed sob that she pulled back under control with visible effort. And then Robert called and told me Emma was alive, and I couldn't stay quiet one more day. I looked at this woman, accomplished, frightened, her career and her conscience both in pieces, and understood exactly what Marcus had done to her. He had found the pressure point and applied precisely enough force, and she had made the choice that frightened people make. Dr. Mitchell, I said, are you willing to testify to everything you've just told me? And it rose, in federal court, with Marcus Hale sitting 20 feet away from you? 5 seconds of silence. Her hands pressed flat against the table, steadying herself. The way you press your hands flat when the ground feels uncertain. Jace, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Jace, He nodded. He stood up and paused at the door. Robert will handle the next steps. Don't speak to anyone. Not colleagues, not family, not anyone claiming to represent Marcus. If anyone contacts you, call Robert immediately. I walked back to Robert's office and closed the door. He stood with my back to him, looking at the wall of legal texts above the credenza. Row after row of dark spines, the accumulated architecture of 100 years of how human beings hold each other accountable. What Marcus had asked Dr. Mitchell in March, 4 months before Emma's surgery, before the diagnosis had even been confirmed as requiring surgical intervention, was not the question of a worried husband. It was reconnaissance. He had identified the weapon, consulted the manual, and waited with extraordinary patience for the right moment to use it. He turned around. Add Dr. Mitchell to the file, I said. And call Patrick Shaw. I want to know what he's found on the cloud server. Robert was already reaching for his phone. 46 days left. Patrick Shaw called me at 6:47 in the evening on day 20. I was in Emma's hospital room when the call came in. She had been moved out of the ICU 4 days earlier, into a private suite on the 8th floor, and the difference was considerable. There were windows now, real windows, looking out over Lake Michigan, and afternoon light came through them in long gold bars that made the room feel almost like a place where normal life might eventually resume. Emma was sitting up in bed reading a novel my assistant had brought her. She had graduated from short sentences and careful sips of water to full paragraphs and actual meals, which the doctors described as remarkable progress, and which I privately attributed to the fact that my daughter had always been more stubborn than her circumstances. He stepped into the corridor to take the call. Mr. Brennan. Patrick's voice had a particular quality, not flat exactly, but deliberately emptied of inflection, the way it got when he was managing information that required careful handling. He had learned to pay close attention when Patrick sounded like that. "I need you to come to the office tonight if possible." "What did you find?" he said. "I'd rather show you in person," he said. I want you to hear it, not have me describe it." I told Emma I had a work matter to handle and would be back in the morning. She looked at me over the top of her novel with those clear eyes of hers and said, "It's the cloud, isn't it?" Again, not a question. He nodded. She put the book down on her lap and said, "Go. Call me after." I was at the IT infrastructure floor of the Brennan Transport building on Wacker Drive by 7:30. Patrick was alone in the server room when I arrived, a lone cool space humming with the particular white noise of 100 machines doing their work in parallel, rack after rack of hardware blinking steadily in the low blue light. He was at his workstation, 2 monitors open, a yellow legal pad beside the keyboard covered in handwritten notes that I could see from across the room were dense and precise and organized. He stood up when I came in. It looked like a man who had been sitting very still for a long time, processing something that required sitting very still. "Sit down, Mr. Brennan," he said, which was unusual. Patrick almost never directed me to do anything. He pulled a chair beside his and waited until I'd taken it. "Walk me through it," I said. Patrick nodded. He turned to the keyboard and pulled up a file directory on the left monitor, a list of automated uploads sorted by device ID and timestamp. Marcus connected his personal iPhone to the company's cloud infrastructure on the second day of the trip. He used his corporate credentials to access the internal document management system. He still had valid login credentials at that point because the credential revocation wasn't processed until day 15. He glanced at me briefly. He was accessing operational files. Distribution contracts, staffing rosters, financial summaries. I assumed he was monitoring the company's performance, perhaps looking for anything that might require his intervention before he returned. He was making sure nothing fell apart before he could come back and claim it, I said. "Yes," Patrick said. "That's what I think, though." He pulled up a second window on the right monitor, a list of audio files, each one labeled with a date, a time, and a file size. What he didn't account for was this. When you connect a personal device to the Brennan Transport Cloud infrastructure, you're prompted to accept the company's device usage policy before access is granted. A standard corporate protocol. It covers data handling, confidentiality, and monitoring provisions. Patrick pointed to a line on the legal pad. Section 4.2. Those of that policy states that any device connected to the company network may be subject to automated logging of communications conducted through or in proximity to the device during the connection period, for purposes of security and compliance monitoring. He looked at the line he was pointing to. Marcus clicked accept, I said. At 2:14 de la tarde on June 22, Patrick said. I have the timestamp. So everything picked up by his phone's microphone while he was connected to our network was automatically uploaded to the company's secure audio log server, Patrick said. Yes. It turned back to the monitor. Most of it is ambient sound. Dick noise, wind, what sounds like a dining room, some music. 37 separate audio files over a period of 9 days. He moved the cursor to a file near the bottom of the list, dated 9 days into the trip. But this one is different. He double-clicked the file. The audio player opened, showing a waveform. Long stretches of relative quiet punctuated by clear spikes of voices speaking close to the device. 23 minutes, Patrick said. Recorded at 9:47 de la noche ship time. Eve listened to all of it. Ella play you the relevant section. He moved the cursor to a point approximately 4 minutes into the recording and pressed play. The sound that came through the workstation speakers was the ambient hum of a ship's engine, low and constant, and the faint clink of glassware. And then voices. 3 voices, close and unhurried. The voices of people who believed themselves to be entirely alone. Vanessa's voice came first, bright and slightly whiny, so faint. She really looked awful at the end, didn't she? Before we left. He almost felt bad. A pause. Then Marcus, measured and dry. Don't. Patricia's voice, sharp and dismissive. Sentiment is for people who can afford it, Vanessa. We cannot afford it right now. The sound of liquid being poured. Then Patricia again, her voice dropping to something more deliberate. Not quieter exactly, but more concentrated. The way a voice gets when it's saying something it has been thinking about for a long time. As long as the girl dies before we get back, everything belongs to our family. The house, the company, all of it. All we have to do is wait. Vanessa again. And you're sure she won't? Man, there's no way she could, right? Marcus, flat and clinical. Without the oxygen concentrator and the cardiac medication, her system will deteriorate within 48 to 72 hours. He asked a specialist about this months ago. These things are predictable, Vanessa. That's what medicine is for. A brief laugh from Vanessa, high and slightly hollow. The laugh of someone who was trying to match the room's tone and not quite succeeding. Patricia, sharp again. Stop making that sound. This is not a laughing matter. This is a business decision. Marcus, smooth and reassuring. She's right. Drink your wine and stop fidgeting. The recording continued for another 19 minutes. Conversation drifting to the next day's itinerary. Complaints about the ship's internet connection. A discussion about what to do with the Lakeshore Drive property once the estate was settled. He sat through all of it. He did not move. He did not speak. He listened to these three people plan the distribution of my daughter's life with the same bored efficiency they might bring to a vacation itinerary, and I let every word of it land where it needed to land. When the file ended, the room was very quiet except for the steady hum of the servers. Patrick reached over and stopped the playback. He looked at me carefully, the way you look at someone when you're not sure what they're going to do next. What I did next was reach into my breast pocket and take out the folded note. He smoothed it open on the desk beside the keyboard. Dad, Marcus planned this. Check the clock. He looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked at Patrick. The timestamps, I said, my voice coming out level and precise and entirely controlled, and I was deeply grateful for that. Every file, every second of audio, I need the chain of custody documented before anything else. The upload logs, the server receipt timestamps, the device ID confirmation, all of it formatted for federal evidentiary standards. Patrick was already writing. I'll have it done tonight. 3 separate secure copies, I said. One to Robert, one to an offsite server, one archived under my personal credentials. He paused. And Patrick, nobody else hears this. Not your team, not the IT director. Nobody. If anyone asks what you've been working on, you tell them routine security audit. Understood, Patrick said without looking up from the legal pad. I folded the note and put it back in my pocket. He stood up. My legs were completely steady. My hands were completely steady. Everything about my exterior at that moment was completely steady. Inside, something had shifted into a place so cold and so absolute that it felt almost like calm. He took out my phone and called Emma. She answered on the second ring. Well, she said. He walked to the far end of the server room, away from Patrick, and stood facing the rack of blinking hardware. I found it, I said, keeping my voice low. All of it. Exactly what you told me to look for. A silence on the line, brief, full. Then Emma's voice, quieter than I'd ever heard it. Are they going to be all right? The recordings, are they going to hold up? Patrick is building the evidentiary file tonight, I said. The device connection to the company network, the policy acceptance timestamp, the upload chain. Everything is documented. Yes, they're going to hold up. Another silence. When Emma spoke again, her voice had changed. Not weaker, but different. Stripped of something, like a person setting down a weight they'd been carrying for a long time. Good, she said. Then let's finish this. How are you feeling? He asked. Angry, she said simply, which is better than scared. How many days do we have left? He looked at the server racks in front of me. 40 rows of blinking lights, patient and precise and indifferent, storing everything Marcus had inadvertently handed us. 40, I said. 40 days. Then stop standing around, Emma said, and I could hear the faint edge of something almost like her old humor in it. Fragile still, but present, unmistakably present. Go home and get some sleep. You sound terrible. For the first time in 20 days, I almost smiled. On day 25, Carol Whitmore walked into my office at 9 in the morning, set a manila folder on my desk without saying a word, sat down in the chair across from me, crossed her arms, and waited. I had known Carol for 22 years. She had joined the Brennan Transport Board of Directors when the company was still small enough that all 7 board members fit comfortably around a single table in a rented conference room on the south side. She had stayed through every expansion, every restructuring, every difficult quarter and triumphant one. She was 64 years old, sharp-featured with close-cropped silver hair, and the particular stillness of a person who had attended enough board meetings to understand that the most important information is usually communicated before anyone starts talking. The fact that she had walked in without calling ahead told me something was wrong. The fact that she hadn't said anything yet told me it was very wrong. He picked up the folder. Inside was a single document, a letter of intent, 42 pages dense with acquisition language and due diligence provisions, bearing the letterhead of Meridian Freight Group. He recognized the name immediately. Meridian was the largest regional freight competitor in the Midwest, a company that had been trying to acquire Brennan Transport through various approaches for the better part of a decade, all of which I had declined with varying degrees of patience. Their CEO, a man named Douglas Reach, had sent me a personal letter 3 years ago suggesting that a merger would be mutually beneficial. He had returned it with a handwritten note that said simply, "Not interested." RB. He read the first 5 pages of the letter of intent. Then I read them again. The proposed purchase price was $430 million. The transaction structure involved the complete acquisition of all Brennan Transport assets, including the distribution network, the real estate holdings, the vehicle fleet, the staffing contracts, and listed separately with particular care, the intellectual property, the proprietary routing algorithms Patrick's team had spent 6 years developing, and the client relationships that represented the company's most durable competitive advantage. The signature line at the bottom of the execution page showed 2 names. Douglas Reach, CEO, Meridian Freight Group, and Marcus Hale, acting as authorized representative of Brennan Transport under power of attorney granted by Emma Brennan Hale, majority shareholder. He set the folder down on the desk. The room was very quiet for a moment. Outside my floor-to-ceiling windows, Lake Michigan was doing what it always did, moving steadily, indifferent to everything occurring above it. I had built this company looking at that lake for 22 years. He had made decisions in this office that had determined the livelihoods of 1,200 people. He had sat in this chair through recessions and rate changes and supply chain crises and the particular terror of the early days when I wasn't sure we were going to make it. And through all of it, The lake had kept moving, and the company had kept growing, and I had kept my hands on the wheel. Marcus had been planning to sell it. Not inherit it, not run it, not build on what it was. Sage it. Take $430 million and disappear. And leave 1,200 people to find out from a press release that the company they had given their working lives to had been liquidated by a man who had never driven a truck, never negotiated a freight contract, never spent a sleepless night wondering if he could make payroll. My jaw was aching. I hadn't realized how hard I'd been clenching it. When did you find this? He asked. My voice came out steady, which took more effort than it should have. Carol uncrossed her arms and leaned forward slightly. 3 days ago, she said. A contact at Meridian's outside counsel reached out to a colleague at my husband's firm regarding a conflict check, standard procedure before any major transaction closes. My husband mentioned it at dinner. He made 2 phone calls the following morning. She paused. The letter of intent was executed on June 17th. 3 days before they left for the Arctic. He did the arithmetic. June 17. Marcus had signed this document, or caused it to be signed using whatever authorization he had fabricated, 3 days before he stood in Emma's bedroom, told her this would all be over soon, and walked out the door. He had already sold the company before he left. He had closed the deal, taken the earnest money, and then gone to the Arctic to wait for the inheritance that would make the transaction legal. The proxy he used, I said. What does it show? Carol reached into her jacket pocket and produced a single folded sheet, a power of attorney document purportedly signed by Emma, granting Marcus full transactional authority on her behalf. She unfolded it and placed it on the desk facing me. I had our corporate attorney compare the signature to Emma's signature on file with the company registrar. He looked at the signature. It was the same forgery I had seen on the loan documents. Close, careful, but not right. The same hand that had practiced on the bank paperwork had practiced on this too. Robert revoked his actual proxy on day 15, I said. I know, Carol said. Which means the authorization Marcus presented to Meridian was fabricated. A forged power of attorney used to execute a transaction worth $430 million. She met my eyes. That's a second count of forgery, Richard. And depending on how the transaction funds were handled, it may also constitute wire fraud at the federal level. It does, I said. Robert's already building that case. I looked at the letter of intent again, then back at Carol. Does Meridian know the proxy was forged? No, Carol said. They conducted standard due diligence. The document looked legitimate. They had no reason to question it. Good, I said. Don't tell them. Carol looked at me steadily. She had worked with me long enough not to be surprised by this, but she wanted to hear the reasoning. Why? She said. Because if Meridian finds out the transaction is void, they'll withdraw and the story ends there, I said. But if Marcus comes home believing the sale is valid and the company is gone, believing he has $430 million and a completed acquisition behind him, then everything he does in the next 35 days is done under that assumption. And everything he does under that assumption becomes evidence. He paused. I want him to walk back into this city thinking he won. I want him to believe, right up until the moment the door opens, that all of this worked exactly as he planned. Carol was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the folder on my desk, then at the lake through the window, then at me. When she finally spoke, her voice was very careful and very deliberate. "Richard," she said, "I've been on this board for 22 years. I watched you build this company from a regional carrier to a market leader. I watched you lose Catherine and keep coming in every morning. I watched you restructure during the 2008 collapse when every other carrier our size went under." She paused. "I need you to tell me something honestly." "Go ahead," I said. "Is Emma going to be all right?" The question landed differently than I expected. Not as a board member's question about liability exposure or succession planning, but as the question of a woman who had known Emma since she was a child, who had attended Catherine's funeral, who had sent flowers every year on Emma's birthday without being asked. My throat tightened. "Used once, just briefly." "Yes," I said. "She's going to be all right." Carol nodded. She reached across the desk and placed her hand over mine for exactly 2 seconds. Firm, warm, and entirely without sentiment. Then she pulled it back, sat up straight, and said, "What do you need from me?" "I need you to convene an emergency board meeting on day 58, I said. 2 days before they come back. I want every member present in person in this building, and I need it done without Marcus having any way to find out it's happening." "Donnie," Carol said. She stood up, picked up the folder, and tucked it back under her arm. "And the Meridian contract?" "Leave it exactly where it is," I said. "Let them think they're buying a company. In 35 days, they're going to find out they bought nothing at all." Carol allowed herself a very small, very precise smile. The smile of a woman who had spent 22 years watching this company refuse to be taken apart by people who underestimated it. "I'll make the calls," she said, and walked out. He sat alone in the boardroom for a long while after she left. Lake Michigan moved steadily past the windows. He thought about 1,200 people who came to work every morning because this company existed. I thought about the rotting algorithms Patrick's team had spent 6 years building. He thought about the 2 beat-up delivery vans I'd bought with a small business loan in 1994 and what it had taken to turn them into what was sitting in this building right now. Then I thought about Marcus Hale standing on a glacier with a glass of champagne, already spending the $430 million in his head. He picked up my phone and called Agent Correa. 35 days left. Agent Dana Correa arrived at Robert's office on day 30 at precisely 9 in the morning, which I noted because I had asked for 9, and people who arrive at precisely the time they're asked to arrive are, in my experience, either very disciplined or very eager to establish that they are in control of their own schedule. Luis Correa, I suspected it was both. She was 41 years old, medium height, with dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested function over preference, and the kind of posture that came from spending years in rooms where posture communicated authority before a word was spoken. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, carrying a briefcase that looked like it weighed considerably more than it should, and she shook my hand once, firm, brief. Exactly the duration required before sitting down across from Robert and me and opening the briefcase without being invited to. "Mr. Brennan," she said. "Mr. Stafford. I've reviewed the materials your office sent over." She placed 3 tabbed folders on the conference table with the efficiency of someone who had done this particular kind of meeting many times and had long since stopped finding any aspect of it interesting except the parts that were actually interesting. "I have questions, and then I'll tell you where we are." "Go ahead," I said. She looked at me directly. Not the polite eye contact of a professional meeting, but the particular focused attention of someone taking your measure. You've known since day 3 that your daughter was deliberately harmed, she said. You've had audio evidence of criminal conspiracy since day 20. You have documentary evidence of bank fraud and forgery dating back to before the subjects left the country. And you haven't contacted law enforcement at any point in the last 30 days. She paused. Why? He had expected this question. He had thought about how to answer it since the night I sat in the hospital corridor and told Robert not to call the police. Because if I had called the police on day 3, I said, Marcus Hale would have been notified by his attorneys within hours. He would have cut the trip short, returned to Chicago with 30 days to prepare a defense, hired the best criminal lawyers in the city, and begun the process of explaining away every piece of evidence as circumstantial, fabricated, or the product of a bitter family dispute. He kept my voice even and unhurried. The audio recording becomes a question of context. The forged signatures become a question of authorization ambiguity. The medical evidence becomes a question of post-surgical complication versus deliberate harm. Every piece of what I have becomes a fight, and fights can be lost. He leaned forward slightly. What I have now is not a fight. It is a case. And I wanted a case. Correa looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "That's a reasonable answer. It's also the answer of someone who has been conducting a private investigation into federal crimes, which creates complications. I'm going to need you to understand." "Tell me," I said. She opened the first folder. "The FBI's jurisdiction in this matter derives from 3 separate federal statutes," she said. Wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. 1343, the use of electronic communications to execute a fraudulent scheme, which covers the forged loan authorization, the forged letter of intent, and the electronic transfers executed using company accounts. Bank fraud under 18 U.S.C. 1344, the $22 million loan obtained using a forged signature on a financial instrument. And money laundering under 18 U.S.C. 1956, specifically the transfer of approximately $2.3 million from Brennan Transport corporate accounts into accounts in Iceland and Greenland during the subject's travel period. She looked up. Additionally, the conspiracy element, 3 subjects coordinating across state and international lines to execute a scheme resulting in serious bodily harm, gives us interstate conspiracy jurisdiction under 18 U.S.C. 371. Robert was making notes. He was watching Correa. "There's also," she said, with a precision that suggested she had saved this for a reason, "the matter of the attempted murder charge. That's a state charge, Illinois law. My office will be coordinating with the Cook County State's attorney, but the criminal homicide component falls under state jurisdiction. What we own is the financial crime architecture." She closed the folder. "Together, the exposure for Marcus Hale is substantial. We're looking at a sentencing range that, absent cooperation agreements, would put him away for the better part of 2 decades. 15 years, I said. That's the number I've been working with." Correa tilted her head slightly, not disagreement, but the professional's instinct to neither confirm nor commit. "Sentencing is the judge's domain," she said. "What I can tell you is that the evidentiary package your IT director assembled is among the most complete pre-arrest documentation I've encountered in 16 years of financial crimes work." A pause, very brief, but present. "Your Patrick Shaw is meticulous." "He is," I said. "I want him available for a formal evidentiary interview within the week," she said. "I also want Dr. Mitchell, and I want full access to the cloud server logs, the building security footage, and the complete credit card transaction history, not the summaries your attorney has been working from, the raw data. Robert will provide everything you need, I said. There's one thing I need from you in return. Correa looked at me with the expression of a woman who had negotiated with a great many people who had things she needed and had learned to wait for the ask before evaluating it. The arrest, I said. I don't want it at ORE when they land. I don't want it at a hotel or a police precinct or anywhere that is efficient and clean and removed from what they actually did. He looked at her steadily. I want it at the Lake Shore Drive property on day 60, when they walk through that door. I want my daughter in that room. Robert shifted slightly in his chair beside me. Not objection, just awareness. Correa studied me for a long moment. The briefcase was closed in front of her. Outside the window, the LaSalle Street traffic moved in its usual relentless stream. You understand, she said carefully, that a residential arrest involving 3 subjects creates logistical and safety considerations that a controlled environment does not. I understand, I said. You also understand that your daughter's presence at the scene of an arrest as a victim of the crimes being prosecuted is not standard procedure and could create complications for the prosecution if it's perceived as victim confrontation rather than lawful enforcement. I understand that too, I said. Robert has been in contact with the state's attorney's office. The victim's presence at the arrest location is permissible, provided she is positioned as an observer, not a participant, and provided the arresting agents retain full operational control of the scene. Correa glanced at Robert, who nodded once. She looked back at me. Your daughter, she said, has to be able to walk into that room under her own power and stand there without assistance. If her medical condition requires support personnel, those personnel need to be invisible to the subjects until after the arrest is executed. She can walk, I said. The certainty in my voice surprised even me, but it was real. I had watched Emma walk the length of the rehabilitation corridor at Northwestern the previous week, slow and deliberate and completely determined, and I had understood then that she would be ready. She'll be ready. Correa held my gaze for another moment. Then she picked up her pen. The silence lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Patricia recovered first, or tried to. She took a step forward with her chin up and her voice pitched at the register she used when she intended to dominate a room. Richard, what on earth are you doing here? He looked at her, then at the table. Look at the note, I said quietly. She looked down at the coffee table, at the folded paper with its red lipstick letters. Her face did something complicated and uncontrolled, the first genuinely unguarded expression I had ever seen on her. Marcus was staring at me. His face had gone the color of old ash. The carry-on bag in his hand dropped from his fingers without him appearing to notice. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Vanessa had taken 3 steps backward until her shoulders hit the hallway wall. Her hands were pressed flat against the plaster behind her, trembling visibly, her eyes moving between me and the note and the door and back again, like someone calculating exits and finding none of them available. He looked at Marcus for a long moment. He had called me dead 2 years ago on a terrace in the October wind. He had looked at me with eyes I had believed were honest. You had 60 days, I said. I had 60 days. The difference is what we did with them. Marcus Joe worked. He was trying to locate something, an argument, an explanation, the smooth professional composure that had carried him through every room he'd ever been in. He couldn't find any of it. His hands had started to shake. His eyes were doing something desperate and searching, moving around the room, taking in Frank and the three figures in dark clothing position at the edges, and Carol Whitmore standing near the credenza with her arms crossed and her face absolutely still. Then he looked at the staircase. Emma was standing at the top, one hand on the new post, looking down at him. She was wearing a dark blue dress and her hair was down, and she was completely, entirely, unmistakably alive. The sound Marcus made was not a word. It was something that came from below language, a short ragged exhalation, as though something had struck him in the chest hard enough to take the air out of him. Emma descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate and unhurried and completely under her own power. She reached the bottom and crossed the room and stopped 3 feet in front of her husband and looked at him with the level clear gaze of a woman who had written a note in lipstick on a grocery receipt in the dark and trusted that it would be enough. "How was Svalbard?" she said. Marcus laughed. He moved without warning, without the calculation that had defined every other thing he'd done in the past 60 days. Pure reflex, pure panic, reaching for Emma with both hands, as though he could somehow undo the last 2 months by closing the distance between them. Frank's hand came down on Marcus's shoulder like a structural collapse. One movement, total and immediate, spinning Marcus away from Emma and down onto one knee on the hardwood floor. Frank's grip on his arm at an angle that allowed for no resistance whatsoever. Marcus cried out, a short high involuntary sound, and went still. Patricia screamed. Vanessa's knees buckled and she slid down the hallway wall until she was sitting on the floor with her hands over her face, her whole body shaking, making a sound that was somewhere between crying and hyperventilating. Agent Correa stepped forward from the right side of the room, badge in one hand, folded arrest warrant in the other. She looked down at Marcus Hale on the floor with the expression of a woman who had been building toward this moment for 30 days and found it entirely satisfactory. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Don't move." Marcus was still on the floor when I nodded to Patrick. The screen on the far wall came to life. The first image was simple. A data readout from the backup oxygen concentrator. A timeline. A flat line where the device signal should have been. 51 hours of nothing, starting at 11:22 de la noche on June 20th. Patricia stared at it, her mouth open. She said, "That doesn't prove." The second image stopped her. Building exterior camera footage, timestamp June 20th, 10:58 de la noche. The quality was sharp. Marcus was clearly visible carrying a large black canvas bag out of the building's service entrance and placing it in the trunk of a cab. The bag had the particular weight of someone carrying glass bottles, prescription bottles. The room was very quiet. The third image was the credit card statement. 60 days. Every transaction itemized. The helicopter over the glacier. The Michelin dinner. The diamond bracelet Vanessa had bought herself on day 11 in Reykjavik. Grand total at the bottom, $267,412. Charged to Brennan Transport corporate accounts. Carol Whitmore stepped forward from the credenza. Her voice was completely flat. "Mr. Hale, for the record, you were removed from every authorized position within this company on June 5th. You had no legal authority to use those accounts for a single transaction." Marcus, still on one knee with Frank's hand on his shoulder, said nothing. His jaw was working, but nothing was coming out. The bank representative, a thin man in a gray suit, stood up from his chair near the window. "Mr. Hale," he said. The $22 million loan executed on June 14 carries a signature that our forensic document team has confirmed is not consistent with Ms. Brennan's authenticated signature on file. Under federal statute, the instrument is void. The full principal and accrued interest is your personal liability. Marcus had snapped up. That's not. But Patrick was already pressing play. The audio was clear. The ship's ambient hum, the clink of glasses, three voices in a room that believed itself to be private. Vanessa first, she really looked awful at the end, didn't she? Before we left. He almost felt bad. Marcus, don't. Patricia, sentiment is for people who can afford it, Vanessa. We cannot afford it right now. Then Patricia's voice, slower and more deliberate, as long as the girl dies before we get back, everything belongs to our family. The house, the company, all of it. All we have to do is wait. Marcus, without the oxygen concentrator and the cardiac medication, her system will deteriorate within 48 to 72 hours. He asked a specialist about this months ago. These things are predictable. Then Vanessa's laugh, high and hollow and unmistakable. The recording continued. I watched Vanessa's face as she heard herself laugh. It happened in stages. First, the color left her face entirely, not slowly but all at once, like a light being switched off. Then her hands came up and pressed against her mouth. Then her shoulders caved inward. Then the sound started, a high broken keening that she was trying to hold behind her hands and couldn't. She sank to the floor. I'm sorry, she said, her voice muffled and wrecked. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. He knew it was wrong. He knew from the beginning. I'm so sorry. Patricia spun toward her. Vanessa, stop talking. Do not say another word. Man, they have the recording. I said stop. We left her there to die. Vanessa's voice broke entirely, raw and ragged, tears streaming down her face. We left Emma there to die, and I didn't do anything, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Marcus twisted toward his mother. This was your idea. You said it was clean. You said there was no way. Patricia's voice had gone shrill and furious. You planned every piece of it. The doctor, the loan, the company sale, that was all you. Because you told me to. I never told you to forge signatures. A hint. Korea raised one hand. The room went quiet immediately, not because she was loud, but because she carried the particular authority of someone backed by the full weight of the federal government and had no need to raise her voice. That's enough, she said. She nodded to her team. Two agents moved to Marcus. Two moved to Patricia. A third crossed to Vanessa, who was still on the floor, and crouched beside her and said something quiet that I didn't hear. He looked at him as she was standing 6 feet away, watching her husband be handcuffed with an expression of absolute stillness. Not satisfaction, not grief, not anger. He used the particular calm of someone who had survived something and was watching the last piece of it finally be put away. He picked up the note from the coffee table. As the agents brought Marcus toward the door, he stopped. He looked back at me across the room. His suit was wrinkled. His face was destroyed. Everything he had built, the performance, the patience, the careful 2-year construction of a man I had trusted, was completely gone. You destroyed my life, he said. He held up the note. Emma's handwriting, red lipstick on a grocery receipt. No, I said. You did that yourself. He just made sure there was a record of it. Korea's team walked him out the door. After they took Marcus away, the apartment got very quiet. The quiet of a room after something that needed to happen had finally happened. The particular stillness of air that had been holding its breath for 60 days and was only now allowed to release. Robert stayed in the living room to deal with the paperwork. Agent Korea's team processed the scene with professional efficiency. Carol shook my hand, said call me tomorrow, and left without ceremony. Emma and I went to the kitchen. She filled the kettle without asking if I wanted tea. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where 60 days ago I had watched Patricia and Marcus exchange glances over coffee cups and told myself I was imagining things. And I watched my daughter move through her own kitchen with the careful deliberateness of someone relearning the coordinates of a familiar space. Her hands shook slightly when she set the cups down. Your hands, I said. I know, she said. They've been doing that since the stairs. The doctor said it might take a few more weeks. It's not dangerous. She looked at her hands for a moment, then looked up at me. Dad, are you all right? The question caught me somewhere I wasn't expecting. Yes, I said. Then, no, I don't know. Emma reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her grip was firm despite the trembling. That's the most honest thing you've said in 60 days, she said. Frank appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had his jacket over one arm and the expression of a man who had finished what he came to do. Meridian Freight Group withdrew from the acquisition this afternoon. Their legal team contacted Robert at 4 when the arrest went public. They're reviewing their exposure on the forged proxy documentation. Robert says they'll likely pursue civil action against Hale personally. Good, I said. Frank nodded once. He looked at Emma. Glad you're home, Miss Brennan. Emma's eyes went bright for just a moment. Thank you, Frank, she said. For everything. He nodded again and walked out. A moment later, I heard the front door close with its quiet solid click. The kettle finished. Emma poured the tea. She set a cup in front of me and wrapped both hands around her own and looked at me across the table in the early evening light coming through the kitchen window. The light that fell on Lake Michigan every evening. The same light I had watched from 42 floors up for 22 years. The same light that had been here before any of this and would be here after all of it. She would have loved this, you know, Emma said. She didn't say Catherine's name. She didn't need to. The two of us, no more fighting to do. My throat closed completely without warning. The sudden contraction of 60 days of not allowing this. 60 days of precision and control and doing the next thing and the next thing. I love it arriving at once in the space between one breath and the next. He pressed my hand over my eyes. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then I lowered it and picked up the tea. She would have been proud of you too, I said. More, actually. Emma shook her head slightly, her own eyes bright. Don't do that. I'm not doing anything. I'm stating a fact. She laughed. A real laugh, short and slightly wet and entirely genuine. The first real laugh I had heard from her in 60 days. And it landed in my chest like something coming home. We sat there until Robert finished in the living room and came to find us and said the initial paperwork was complete and he'd need signatures in the morning. We sat there until the light changed and the kettle went cold and the city outside the window went from gold to gray to the particular amber of Chicago after dark. We didn't talk about Marcus. We didn't talk about the trial. We didn't talk about what came next. We drank our tea. We sat in the kitchen that belonged to my daughter. And for the first time in 60 days, I let tomorrow wait. The trial lasted 4 months. Marcus Hale was sentenced to 15 years for attempted murder in the second degree, bank fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Full restitution. Asset forfeiture covering every account, every holding, every piece of property Marcus had accumulated. Patricia received 7 years. Vanessa, who had cooperated fully and testified clearly, received 4. The gavel came down. It sounded like a door closing. Marcus did not look at me when they let him out. He had stopped looking at me after the day in the apartment, after I had held his gaze until he looked away. Emma was very still beside me as they led him through the side door. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her face was calm. Outside the courthouse on the steps, the February air was cold and clean, and the city moved past us in its usual indifferent rush. Emma turned her face up toward the pale winter sun. For a moment, eyes closed, just breathing. Then she said, "Okay." Used that, one word. But I understood everything it contained. 9 months later, in December, I drove to a converted row house on West 115th Street in Chicago that Emma had leased for what she was calling a small office. The sign beside the door read the Catherine Fund, supporting financial independence for survivors of coercive control. She had named it after her mother. The office was one large room with 2 desks and a waiting area with chairs that Emma had picked out herself. Comfortable, she had told me, because people came here on the worst days of their lives, and they shouldn't have to sit in uncomfortable chairs. There were plants on the windowsill. There was a photograph of Catherine on the wall behind Emma's desk. Back in the summer Emma was 15. Both of them laughing at something outside the frame. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Through the glass panel beside the door, I could see Emma at her desk across from a young woman I didn't recognize, perhaps 25, wearing a winter coat she hadn't taken off, her hands wrapped around a paper cup, listening to Emma with the focused attention of someone receiving something they had not expected to be offered. He did not go in. I stood on the sidewalk and watched my daughter through the glass. She was leaning forward slightly, her elbows on the desk, talking with her hands the way she always did when she was explaining something she cared about. He reached into my breast pocket. The note was there. It was always there, had been there every day since Frank had handed it to me in the dark on a 4th-floor hallway. The thermal paper had gone soft at the creases. The red lipstick letters had faded to the color of dried roses. "Dad, Marcus planned this. Check the club." He read it one more time. Then I folded it very carefully. He put it in my wallet. Not the breast pocket, not the place I had been carrying it for 18 months. But the wallet, the place where you put things you are keeping rather than things you are holding on to. It was a small difference. It was everything. He put the wallet in my jacket pocket. He looked through the glass at Emma, who was still talking, still leaning forward, still giving the young woman in the winter coat her complete and undivided attention. She didn't see me standing there. She was too busy doing what she had decided to do with what she had survived. He turned up my collar against the December cold. He walked back to my cab. I sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel, looking at the row house, at the small sign beside the door, at my daughter's name on the lease agreement I had co-signed 3 months ago, the Catherine Fund. He started the car. I drove home through the December streets of Chicago. The lights, the traffic, the city that kept moving no matter what. And I thought about 2 beat-up delivery vans in a rented garage on the south side in 1994. And about Catherine laughing at something outside the frame of a photograph. And about a note written in red lipstick on a grocery receipt in the dark. I thought about my daughter saying I'll be ready to an empty room. I thought about how she had been. Then I stopped thinking about all of it because there was nothing left to think about. It was done. People ask me if I regret waiting 60 days. I don't. What I regret is the years before, staying quiet because I wanted to believe the best in people who had already decided the worst about us. Family betrayal doesn't announce itself loudly. It arrives quietly, wearing the face of someone you trusted, speaking in the voice of someone you loved. If this story taught me anything, trust what you observe, not what you're told. I believe God places the right things in our hands at exactly the right moment. A backup device, a grocery receipt, a lipstick in a cardigan pocket. Small things. And now things. Don't be like me, patient when you should have been firm. Family betrayal at this level builds slowly, in small silences we choose not to question. The most dangerous person in your life is never a stranger. It's someone who knows exactly how much you love them and chooses to use it against you. Thank you for staying until the very end.